The uncomfortable truth, what Tony Robbins figured out that nobody else will tell you. There is a version of your life that you have never lived. A version where the decisions came easier, where the fear was quieter, where the results actually matched the effort you put in. You have felt it before, that brief electric moment when you sensed that something bigger was possible for you. And then, almost as fast as it arrived, it disappeared, replaced by doubt, by routine, by the slow, grinding weight of a life that feels just slightly smaller than the one you were meant for. What if that feeling wasn't weakness? What if it was actually the most important signal your mind has ever sent you, and you were never taught how to read it? That is what this video is about, not motivation, not hype, the actual uncomfortable, rarely spoken truth about why some people break through and most people don't, and once you understand it, you cannot unlearn it. Let's begin with something that might make you uncomfortable. Most people who want success are doing everything right on the surface. They are reading the books, watching the videos, setting the goals, writing the plans. They are consuming information about wealth and success at a rate that would have been unimaginable to any previous generation in human history, and yet statistically, the outcomes have not changed dramatically. The gap between people who build meaningful wealth and people who spend their entire lives wishing they could, that gap remains stubbornly, almost insultingly wide. Why? That is the question that has driven some of the most serious thinkers in psychology, behavioral economics, and human performance for the last 50 years. And the answer, when you finally see it clearly, is both simpler and more confronting than most people are prepared to accept. The problem is not information. The problem is never information. The problem is something that lives much deeper than information, something embedded in how you were taught to see yourself, how you were taught to relate to money, and what you unconsciously believe you are actually allowed to have. Success is not primarily a strategy problem. It is an identity problem, and until you understand that distinction at the deepest level, no strategy in the world will save you. There is a man most people know as an entertainer, a motivational speaker, someone who sells tickets to large arenas and makes people feel good for a weekend before they go home and return to their ordinary lives. That is the caricature. That is what the critics say. But there is a different way to look at the body of work, one that strips away the theater and asks a far more serious question. What did this man actually figure out about human psychology that made his ideas resonate with tens of millions of people across 6 decades and dozens of countries? Because when you look past the showmanship, the actual intellectual architecture underneath is remarkable. It draws from cognitive behavioral psychology, from neuro-linguistic programming, from Stoic philosophy, from behavioral economics decades before that field even had a mainstream name. It is, at its core, a serious attempt to answer one of the oldest and most important questions a human being can ask. Why do people who want to change so rarely do? The answer he kept arriving at, the answer that the research kept confirming, was this: human beings do not primarily make decisions based on logic. They make decisions based on their emotional state in the moment and the invisible story they believe about who they are. And those two things, emotional state and identity story, are almost entirely invisible to the person experiencing them. Which means most people are being controlled by a script they have never read, following rules they never agreed to, living inside boundaries they never consciously chose. That is the uncomfortable truth, and it gets more uncomfortable from here. Think about the last time you had a genuine opportunity in front of you. Maybe it was a business idea that actually had merit. Maybe it was a conversation with someone who could have opened a significant door. Maybe it was a moment where you could have invested, taken the risk, made the move, and you didn't. And if you were honest with yourself in the quiet that followed, it wasn't because the logic didn't add up. It was because something inside you, something fast, powerful, and completely irrational, said, "This is not for people like you." Psychologists have a technical term for this. They call it the upper limit problem. The idea that every human being has an unconscious ceiling, a maximum level of success, joy, or abundance that their nervous system has been conditioned to consider normal. And when life begins to exceed that ceiling, the unconscious mind does something extraordinary. It self-sabotages, not out of stupidity, not out of weakness, but out of a desperate attempt to return to what feels familiar. Because the nervous system, at its most primitive level, does not distinguish between familiar and safe. It treats them as the same thing. This is why you have watched people receive incredible luck, a promotion, an inheritance, a business windfall, and then systematically destroy it within 18 months. Not because they were reckless or irresponsible, but because their nervous system was operating at a level their identity couldn't sustain. Their external reality had exceeded their internal story, and the unconscious mind course-corrected with brutal efficiency. This is also why financial literacy alone does not solve poverty. Study after study of lottery winners has shown that the vast majority return to their previous financial state within 5 years, not because money is hard to manage, but because their internal identity remained unchanged. They had millionaire money and a working-class self-concept. And the self-concept always wins. Always. Now let's talk about a different kind of story. Not a famous person, not a celebrity case study, somebody far more ordinary, and for that reason, far more relevant to your life. Imagine a woman in her early 30s. She grew up in a household where money was always discussed in one of two ways. Either it was scarce and stressful, a source of tension and quiet panic, or it was something that other people had, people who were different, luckier, somehow chosen. She absorbed this without knowing she was absorbing it. Children always do. By the time she was an adult, she had built a complete unconscious belief system around money, that wanting too much of it was greedy, that people who had a lot of it had probably compromised something important to get it, and that the responsible, dignified thing to do was to work hard, spend carefully, and be grateful for what you had. She was smart, educated, she worked hard and moved up steadily in her career, on the outside. She looked like someone on the right trajectory, but every time a significant opportunity appeared, every time she was close to a real leap in income or responsibility, something happened. She got cautious. She found reasons why the timing was wrong. She convinced herself that she needed more preparation, more credentials, more certainty before she could justify the move. She was not lazy, she was not unambitious. She was operating under an invisible script that told her at the deepest level that she had already reached approximately as far as someone like her was supposed to reach. And that script was not written by her. It was written by the environment she grew up in, reinforced by years of repetition, and so deeply embedded in her sense of self that she had never once stopped to question whether it was actually true. The turning point for her, and this is the part that matters, was not a motivational seminar. It was not a book. It was a single, devastatingly simple question that somebody asked her during a conversation that she almost didn't have. The question was this: whose beliefs are you actually living by? She sat with that question for 3 days, and on the third day something cracked open. She realized that almost every major assumption she held about money, about ambition, about what was appropriate for her, had come from other people, people who had never built the life she was quietly dreaming about. She had inherited a worldview secondhand, and she had never once audited it. Within 14 months, she had started her own business, negotiated her first significant client contract, and tripled her annual income. Not because she had discovered a new strategy, because she had finally identified and dismantled the invisible ceiling that had been governing her life. This brings us to the first lesson, and I want you to sit with this one because it is the foundation that everything else rests on. Your beliefs about money are not yours. They were installed before you had the cognitive capacity to evaluate them. Every conversation you overheard as a child about wealth, about ambition, about what was possible for people in your family, in your neighborhood, in your circumstances, all of it went into your unconscious mind without a filter. And your unconscious mind, in its relentless effort to keep you consistent with its internal model of who you are, has been quietly enforcing those beliefs ever since, shaping your decisions, calibrating your risk tolerance, limiting your ask, setting your ceiling. The work, the real, serious, unglamorous work, is not to find a better investment strategy or a more efficient morning routine. It is to go back and question the foundational assumptions that are running the show underneath every strategy and routine you have ever tried. Because a powerful strategy built on a broken belief system will always eventually collapse back into the shape of that broken belief. The second lesson is about the difference between two kinds of pain and why most people make the wrong choice between them every single time. There is the pain of discipline and the pain of regret. They are both real, they are both uncomfortable, but they are not equal. The pain of discipline is short, sharp, and ultimately generative. You feel it in the moment of the hard choice, the early morning when you don't want to get up, the conversation you don't want to have, the investment you're afraid to make. But that pain is a deposit. Every time you choose it, you are building something. You are strengthening the evidence that you are the kind of person who follows through. The pain of regret is the opposite. It is diffuse, long, and it accumulates. It doesn't come in one sharp moment. It arrives slowly, over years, in the quiet times, in the gap between the life you are living and the life you know you could have built. And unlike the pain of discipline, it produces nothing. It is pure cost with no return. The reason most people choose comfort over discipline is not because they are weak. It is because their brain is running a very effective short-term calculation that completely ignores the long-term ledger. The human nervous system was not designed to feel tomorrow's regret as vividly as it feels today's discomfort. So it defaults to relief, every time, unless you consciously intervene. Intervention is simple, but it requires practice. When you are standing at the edge of a difficult choice, you do not ask yourself how you feel right now. You ask yourself who you will be if you make this choice consistently for the next 5 years. You make the decision not as the person you currently are, but as the person you are in the process of becoming. That shift from present feeling to future identity is one of the most powerful psychological tools available to any human being. And almost nobody uses it. The third lesson goes deeper. It is about the story you tell yourself about why your life looks the way it does. Human beings are narrative creatures. We do not experience life as a series of random events. We experience it as a story with a protagonist, with causes and effects, with a coherent explanation for how we ended up here. And the story we tell ourselves about our past is not a neutral record. It is a living document that we are constantly rewriting to confirm what we already believe about ourselves. If you believe you are someone who cannot sustain wealth, you will look back at your financial history and find abundant evidence to support that conclusion. If you believe you are someone who always gets overlooked, you will look back at your career and find a perfectly constructed narrative of being passed over and undervalued. The story is not lying to you. It is showing you real events. But it is selecting which events to emphasize, which to minimize, and what meaning to assign to each. And it is doing all of that in service of confirming the identity you already hold. The most important financial and professional decision you will ever make is not where to invest or what business to start. It is the decision about which story to tell, not an optimistic fantasy, not a delusion, but a deliberately chosen interpretation of your own life that emphasizes your capacity rather than your limitation. That looks at every setback as data rather than verdict. That treats the present not as a conclusion, but as a chapter. People who build lasting wealth and meaningful success are not people who had easier lives. Most of them did not. They are people who constructed a story about their lives that made their current struggle meaningful and their eventual success inevitable. And they told that story so consistently, to themselves and to others, that it stopped being a story and became a reality. Now we arrive at the part of this conversation that most people skip, because it is the least comfortable and the most necessary. None of what you have just heard matters if you do not act on it, not eventually, not when the timing is better, not after you have read 3 more books or watched 20 more videos. Now, today, in the next 24 hours with the exact life and resources you currently have. Because here is the thing about momentum that nobody tells you clearly enough. It does not begin with a big move. It begins with the smallest possible action that is consistent with the identity you are trying to build. Not the action that changes everything. The action that changes you. The action that creates one new piece of evidence, just one, that you are the kind of person who moves instead of waits. What is that action for you? It is different for every person watching this. Maybe it is a conversation you have been avoiding. Maybe it is a financial account you need to open, or a budget you need to sit down and face honestly for the first time. Maybe it is a skill you have been meaning to start developing. Maybe it is simply writing down, clearly and specifically, what you actually want, not what you think is reasonable or realistic, but what you genuinely want, and letting yourself look at it without immediately explaining all the reasons it probably won't happen. Whatever that action is, the only question that matters right now is, will you do it before this day is over? There is a moment in the life of almost every person who eventually builds something real, a moment that does not look like a turning point from the outside. There is no fanfare, no obvious drama. It is usually quiet, private, and easy to miss. It is the moment they stop waiting for permission, stop waiting for certainty, stop waiting for the version of themselves that is finally ready, and they simply begin with everything they have, right where they are, imperfect and uncertain and absolutely committed. That moment is available to you right now, not after you feel more prepared, not after the circumstances improve, not after you understand everything you would need to know, right now, in this moment, with this life. The truth that nobody tells you about success is not a secret formula or a hidden strategy. It is this: the person you need to become in order to have the life you want is not a different species. They are not fundamentally different from who you are. They are simply a version of you that decided, somewhere, in some quiet, unremarkable moment, to stop negotiating with their own potential and start living from it. That decision does not require a seminar. It does not require a guru. It requires only one thing: the willingness to look clearly at the story you have been living, decide whether it is actually yours, and if it isn't, to write a different one. The executive mindset exists for one reason: not to tell you what to do, but to keep asking you the questions that most people around you are too comfortable, too busy, or too afraid to ask. If this video gave you something, a perspective you hadn't considered, a question worth sitting with, a moment of recognition, then you already know what to do next. The subscribe button is there. The next video is waiting. And somewhere, in the quiet that follows a decision made with conviction, the next chapter of your life is already beginning. The question is whether you will be the one to write it.